There are 4 foods sitting in your refrigerator right now that most people reheat without thinking twice about it, and I want you to know today exactly why that habit could be doing far more harm than you've ever been told. Not because of some far-fetched theory, and not because of anything I've invented to frighten you, but because of real, documented science that most doctors simply don't take the time to explain properly during a rushed 15-minute appointment. By the time we get to number 1 on this list, you're going to understand something that genuinely changes how you think about your own leftovers. Something that connects directly to why certain chronic health problems become so much more common as we age and what you can start doing differently tonight. I'm Dr. Hale Thorne, and I've spent more than 30 years practicing medicine, a substantial portion of that time spent specifically in conversations about what we eat, how we prepare it, and how those daily habits add up in ways people never see coming until they're already dealing with the consequences. And I'll be honest with you, I've made every mistake on this list myself at some point over the years. The hurried weeknight reheating, the spinach warmed up a 3rd time because nobody wanted to waste it, the chicken pulled straight from the fridge into a hot pan without thinking about it. This isn't a lecture from someone who does everything perfectly. This is one person who spent 3 decades watching these habits play out in real patients, telling another person exactly what I've learned so you don't have to learn it the hard way. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something down in the comments. Tell me your age and tell me honestly, which of these 4 foods do you reheat most regularly? I read every single comment on these videos, and it genuinely shapes what I cover in future ones, so don't hold back. Alright, let's start at number 4 and work our way down to the one I consider the most important by far. Number 4 is rice, and this one surprises people more than almost anything else on this list because rice seems so harmless, so simple, so completely ordinary. The kind of food that's been a staple of human diets across cultures and centuries without anyone treating it as something requiring careful handling. But here's what's actually happening inside that container of leftover rice sitting in your refrigerator right now, and why the way most people handle it puts them at real risk that has nothing to do with the rice itself and everything to do with what grows inside it when given the right conditions. Rice naturally contains spores of a bacteria called Bacillus cereus, spores that survive the original cooking process entirely intact, the same way certain weed seeds survive a fire and actually grow back stronger afterward. When cooked rice cools down slowly at room temperature, those spores germinate and multiply at a rate that most people genuinely cannot imagine, doubling in population in just a few hours under the right conditions, which describes most kitchen counters after dinner quite precisely. Warm air temperature, a covered container that traps moisture, a few hours while the dishes are being cleaned up and the family disperses for the evening. The heat-resistant toxin this bacteria produces as it multiplies is the real problem, because that toxin survives reheating, even thorough reheating, meaning that by the time your rice is hot again the following day and smells perfectly fine and looks completely normal and passes every intuitive test you'd apply to it before eating, the toxin responsible for causing a serious gastrointestinal illness is already fully present and will absolutely do its job once consumed, regardless of how hot you've made the rice around it. I've had patients come into my office describing what they assumed was a stomach flu that hit them several hours after dinner, miserable, unable to keep anything down, certain they'd caught something circulating through the family or the workplace, and when we traced it back carefully through exactly what they'd eaten and how it had been stored and handled, leftover rice reheated the following day was the culprit in more cases than I could count across 3 decades of practice. What makes this particularly frustrating from a patient care perspective is that by the time someone connects their symptoms to the specific meal that caused them, the connection is almost impossible to prove definitively, which means most people never actually learn the real cause and simply continue the same storage habits indefinitely, going through the same experience again months later and still never making the connection. This doesn't mean you can never eat leftover rice. It means you need to be specific and intentional about how you handle it. Cool it quickly after cooking, within an hour if possible, by spreading it out on a flat surface, or dividing it into smaller shallow containers rather than leaving a large covered pot sitting on the counter while the rest of the kitchen cleanup happens around it. Refrigerate it immediately rather than leaving it out because you're planning to eat more later in the evening. Store it for no more than a day, 2 at absolute most. And when you do reheat it, bring it to a genuinely high internal temperature throughout, not just warm enough to be comfortable to eat, but steaming hot all the way through, which requires more attention than most people give to a bowl going into the microwave. The difference between handling this carefully and handling it casually is genuinely the difference between a fine meal the next day and a very unpleasant night that could, in vulnerable patients, require medical attention. Number 3 is leafy green vegetables. And spinach specifically is the one I want to focus on here because it has become so popular as a health food over the past 2 decades that people often prepare large batches of it at once and then reheat portions throughout the week, which seems perfectly sensible from a time efficiency standpoint but creates a real and specific chemical concern that almost nobody in a conventional medical setting ever explains clearly. Spinach, along with other leafy greens like Swiss chard and beet greens, is naturally very high in compounds called nitrates, and this is actually one of the reasons these vegetables are genuinely good for you, supporting healthy blood pressure and cardiovascular function through a mechanism that researchers have studied extensively and confirmed repeatedly. Nitrates play a real and beneficial role in the body when consumed fresh or lightly cooked and eaten promptly. This part of the story is entirely positive, and I don't want anything I say next to make you think you should stop eating spinach, because that would be exactly the wrong conclusion to draw. Here's where the problem enters, and it's a specific problem connected to temperature, time, and bacteria. When cooked spinach sits, even in the refrigerator, bacterial activity continues at a slow rate, and those bacteria convert the beneficial nitrates in the spinach into nitrites. When you then reheat that spinach, particularly at high temperatures, those nitrites interact with proteins in the food to form compounds called nitrosamines. This same chemistry is why processed meats are a concern, but in spinach, the starting compound, the nitrate, is present in far higher concentrations than in most other foods, which means the potential for conversion when given heat and time is also higher. Nitrosamines have genuine, documented, well-established associations with increased cancer risk in the digestive system, associations that have been studied across multiple large research populations over several decades and are not seriously disputed in the scientific literature. Organizations that study cancer risk at a population level take this chemistry seriously, and it is one of the specific reasons that food safety guidance in several countries recommends against reheating cooked spinach and other high-nitrate leafy greens more than once. I want to be clear about something here, and I'll be more specific than I was a moment ago. The association is specifically with repeated high-heat reheating of high-nitrate vegetables, not with eating spinach fresh or cooked once and eaten promptly, which carries no meaningful concern of this kind at all. A patient of mine, a retired schoolteacher named Beverly, 73 years old, who had started preparing large batches of sautéed spinach every Sunday and then reheating portions for breakfast throughout the week because she'd read about its health benefits for bone density and energy, was genuinely alarmed when I explained this to her, initially interpreting it as a reason to give up spinach entirely, which would have been completely unnecessary and actually counterproductive given her goals. What we adjusted was simply the preparation habit, cooking smaller amounts fresh several times a week rather than one large batch once, which took only slightly more time and practice and completely eliminated the concern while preserving all of the genuine nutritional benefit. She later told me this was the single most practically useful thing she'd learned in a medical context in years, not because the change itself was difficult, but because nobody had ever explained to her that the way she was preparing a food she'd specifically chosen for its health benefits was potentially undermining some of those same benefits through repeated reheating. Number 2 is cooked potatoes, and this one connects back to a similar bacterial mechanism as rice, but with an additional specific concern that makes it worth addressing separately, rather than simply grouping it with the rice conversation we already had. Like cooked rice, cooked potatoes that are left at room temperature rather than promptly refrigerated create exactly the kind of warm, moist, starchy environment where certain bacteria multiply aggressively, and the resulting toxins survive subsequent reheating in much the same way. If you've ever cooked a large batch of potatoes for a family dinner and left the extras sitting on the counter through the evening and into the following morning because the refrigerator felt too crowded or too inconvenient in the moment, you've created those conditions without necessarily ever knowing it. And the leftovers that seem perfectly fine the next day may have already crossed a threshold that wasn't visible, wasn't smellable, and wasn't detectable through any normal kitchen assessment. But potatoes have an additional issue that's specific to how people tend to reheat them, particularly in high-heat environments like an oven, or especially a microwave operated at maximum power, which is how most people use it because it's the fastest option. When starchy foods like potatoes are reheated at very high temperatures, they produce a compound called acrylamide through a chemical reaction between certain amino acids and sugars that occurs specifically at high temperatures, above roughly 120 degrees Celsius, which in practical kitchen terms means any point at which the food starts to brown, crisp, or develop that darker color most people associate with fully reheated or well-cooked starch. This is the same reaction that produces the golden color in French fries, in potato chips, in toasted bread, and in many other brown starchy foods. Acrylamide has been identified by food safety researchers and regulatory agencies across multiple countries as a substance of concern for long-term health. And while the science is not yet at the level of certainty that exists for the nitrosamine processed meat connection we'll discuss in a moment, the concern is real, the research is ongoing, and the practical guidance is straightforward enough that it makes sense to apply it without waiting for complete scientific consensus. I had a patient, a man named Raymond, 67 years old, who made roasted potatoes every Sunday in a large batch, and then reheated servings throughout the week, often putting them in his toaster oven at high heat specifically to try to get them crispy again, which is exactly the preparation method that drives acrylamide formation most aggressively. He was genuinely surprised to learn that the thing he was doing specifically to improve the eating quality of his leftovers was precisely the thing creating the greater concern from a health perspective. We talked through a simpler approach, cooking smaller quantities of fresh potatoes more frequently, rather than one large batch intended for most of the week, something that took maybe 15 minutes of active preparation more per week in total, but completely changed the risk profile of how he was eating one of his most frequently consumed foods. He told me, at his next visit, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd expected this to feel like a significant sacrifice, and it had turned out to be completely unnoticeable in practice. Now, a quick pause here, because if you've made it this far in this video, you're clearly someone who takes what goes into their body seriously, and that already puts you meaningfully ahead of most people. Go ahead and tap that like button if any of this is connecting the dots in a way you hadn't thought about before. It genuinely helps this information reach more people who need to hear it. And let me know in the comments, out of numbers 4, 3, and 2, which one genuinely surprised you the most. I read every single comment every time. And now we get to number 1. The food I genuinely consider the most important on this list, the one that carries the most well-documented health concerns when reheated, and the one that's sitting in the refrigerators of millions of people right now, ready to be popped back into a pan or a microwave tomorrow morning without a second thought. Number 1 is processed and cured meat, and I want to be very specific here about what I mean by that term, because I'm not talking about a plain piece of grilled chicken breast you cooked yourself from a raw, unprocessed cut, or a simple fillet of fish seasoned with herbs and lemon. I'm talking specifically about processed and cured meats, things like sausages, hot dogs, bacon, deli-style ham and turkey, smoked meats of various kinds, the kinds of foods that have been preserved with sodium nitrite as part of their processing and manufacturing, which is an entirely standard practice across virtually the entire processed meat industry, has been for generations, and serves a real purpose in preventing certain types of bacterial growth in the meat during the extended storage and distribution periods that separate manufacture from consumer purchase. Here's the specific concern, and it's one I want you to understand mechanistically, rather than just as a rule to follow without understanding why. Because I've found over 3 decades of practice that people who actually understand the why behind a health recommendation follow it far more consistently than those who simply received an instruction. When processed meats, which already contain significant levels of nitrites from the curing process as part of their standard formulation, are reheated at high temperatures, those nitrites react with proteins in the meat to form compounds called nitrosamines at a dramatically accelerated rate. We discussed nitrosamines briefly in the spinach section, but the situation with processed meats is meaningfully different and more concerning for 2 specific reasons. First, the baseline nitrite concentration in cured and processed meats is substantially higher to begin with than the nitrate concentration in even a very nitrate-rich vegetable like spinach, meaning there's far more precursor compound available to undergo the conversion reaction in the first place. Second, the protein environment of meat creates more favorable chemical conditions for nitrosamine formation than the plant fiber environment of a leafy vegetable does, making the yield of the reaction, meaning how much nitrosamine actually forms from the available nitrites, higher in the meat context than in the vegetable context. The result is that reheating processed meats, particularly at the high temperatures most people use for reheating, drives a chemical reaction that produces nitrosamine concentrations that are genuinely concerning from a long-term health perspective, not from a single exposure, not from a single sausage, but from the kind of repeated daily or weekly habit that describes how many people in their 60s and 70s grew up eating and continue to eat now, out of pure familiarity and the simple comfort of what's always been normal. The epidemiological research on this connection is substantial and consistent. Multiple very large studies, the kind that track hundreds of thousands of participants across 15, 20, sometimes more years, have found consistent and statistically significant associations between high consumption of processed meats and elevated risk for cancers of the digestive system, including colorectal cancer specifically, which is the third most commonly diagnosed cancer in the United States, and which has known modifiable dietary risk factors that include precisely this category of food. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is the cancer research arm of the World Health Organization, classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen in 2015, meaning the evidence for a causal relationship is considered sufficient based on decades of accumulated research across multiple countries and research methodologies. Group 1 does not mean the risk from any individual serving is catastrophic. It means the association is real and well established, the same classification category as tobacco smoke, which we also know doesn't cause harm from a single exposure, but absolutely causes harm from decades of repeated exposure, which is precisely the relevant analogy here. I want to pause and acknowledge something because I know this information can feel alarming, and I don't want you to leave this video feeling anxious about the past decades of eating habits you can't change now. What I want you to take from this is not guilt about what you've already done, but clarity about what you can choose differently going forward. The body has remarkable capacity to repair and compensate across decades of time, and the risk reductions associated with changing long-standing dietary habits, even later in life, are real and documented. Not negligible just because the change comes at 60 or 70 rather than at 30. Every single meal is a new decision, and the accumulated effect of better decisions over the next decade genuinely matters for health outcomes in ways that are not wishful thinking, but supported by genuine research. The practical guidance here is specific and realistic. If processed meats are a regular part of your eating habits, consider eating them fresh and cold, as they were designed to be served, rather than heating them again after they've already been cooked once during manufacture. If you do choose to heat them, do it gently, at lower temperatures, and for the shortest time necessary to achieve the temperature you want, rather than high heat frying or microwaving at maximum power. And consider whether the frequency with which you're eating these foods is something worth adjusting, not eliminating entirely if that's not realistic for you, but perhaps shifting from a daily habit to a weekly or occasional one, which substantially reduces the cumulative exposure that drives the long-term concern. I want to take a moment here to talk about something I think is more important than any individual food on this list, and that's the broader pattern of how we handle leftovers in general, because so much of what we've talked about today comes down not just to which specific foods you're reheating, but to how you're handling them across the entire cycle, from cooking to cooling to refrigerating to reheating. The most dangerous situation in almost every case we've discussed is the combination of slow cooling, prolonged storage at borderline temperatures, and high heat reheating. Three factors that together create far more risk than any single one of them would create on its own. If you cook something, cool it quickly by dividing it into smaller containers rather than refrigerating an entire large pot that will take several hours to cool to a safe temperature at its center. And if you've ever reached into a refrigerator the morning after dinner and found that the large pot you put in the night before is still warm in the middle even hours later, you've experienced exactly how slowly this can happen without being visible from the outside. Refrigerate it promptly rather than leaving it out at room temperature while the evening continues around it. Store it for a reasonable and deliberate amount of time rather than vaguely assuming it's fine until it obviously isn't. And reheat it gently rather than blasting it at maximum power until it's steaming hot on the outside while barely warm at the center, which in a microwave at full power is an extremely common result that most people have experienced and dismissed as simply the way microwaves work, when really it's a consistent failure to achieve the uniform safe temperature throughout that makes reheating genuinely safe rather than simply faster. Following these habits eliminates the vast majority of the bacterial risk we discussed with rice and potatoes, without requiring you to give up leftovers entirely, which would be neither realistic nor necessary in the vast majority of households. The chemical concerns with spinach and processed meats are different in nature and require different solutions, specifically cooking smaller amounts and eating them fresh. But the bacterial concerns are largely addressable through better handling rather than avoidance. I also want to address something I hear from patients fairly often, which is a version of, "But I've been doing this my whole life and I've been fine." And I want to be honest about why that response is both completely understandable and somewhat misleading at the same time, because it comes from a completely natural place. We naturally look for evidence that our habits are working, and the absence of visible harm feels like evidence that everything is fine. The health effects we've been talking about today, whether bacterial toxins or nitrosamines from repeated reheating of processed meats, don't operate through single acute exposures that immediately announce themselves with obvious, identifiable symptoms that any reasonable person would recognize and connect back to the specific cause. They operate through cumulative exposure over years and decades, in ways that the body manages and compensates for well below any visible symptom threshold for a very long time, sometimes a remarkably long time. Which is exactly why people who've been doing these things for years honestly feel perfectly fine, until at some point the cumulative damage to certain tissues or the cumulative suppression of certain protective processes reaches a threshold that becomes visible as a diagnosis, a finding, a health event that seems to arrive suddenly and without warning when in reality it has been quietly building for a very long time. The absence of immediate consequence is not the same thing as the absence of harm being done. And this distinction is one of the most important and most consistently misunderstood ideas in all of preventive medicine. And one of the reasons preventive medicine is genuinely difficult to communicate because you are asking people to change behavior based on risks that feel entirely theoretical up until the moment they aren't. This doesn't mean you should look backward and feel guilty about habits formed long before this research was available or widely communicated. It means you have the opportunity to look forward with genuinely better information. And that opportunity is worth taking. I think about the men and women who come into my office for routine checkups, people who've eaten the same way for 40 or 50 years, people who feel genuinely well and are genuinely proud of how little medical care they've required across their lives. And I think about what information they were simply never given, not because anyone wanted to withhold it from them, but because the research wasn't available when their habits were formed. Because the connections between specific food handling practices and long-term health outcomes simply weren't understood at the population level until decades of research eventually made them clear. These are not people who made bad choices. They made perfectly reasonable choices with the information available to them at the time. The gift we have today is better information, and the question is simply what we choose to do with it going forward. I want to be clear about something before we finish here. None of this means you need to throw out everything in your refrigerator tonight, or that you should feel anxious about every meal you've ever eaten, or that the occasional reheated plate of leftover dinner from last night is going to meaningfully affect your health. The concern here is specifically about repeated long-term habits, not isolated individual meals. And the solution is genuinely straightforward. Cool quickly, refrigerate promptly, reheat gently. Avoid processing certain foods more than once or twice. And in the case of processed cured meats specifically, consider eating them fresh rather than as leftovers reheated at high temperature. These are small, practical changes that fit realistically into daily life without requiring anything dramatic or expensive or difficult. So here's what I want you to take away from today. Look at what you currently have in your refrigerator. Think about which of these 4 categories, rice, leafy greens, potatoes, and processed meats, you handle with the least care when it comes to the cooling, storing, and reheating cycle. Pick that one and commit to changing that single habit. Just that one, starting tonight. Not everything at once, not a dramatic overhaul of your entire kitchen routine, just that one thing. In 30 years of practice, I've found that the people who make the most lasting improvements to their health are never the ones who try to change everything simultaneously. They're the ones who pick one thing, do it consistently until it becomes automatic, and then quietly move on to the next one. Before you go, think of someone in your life who's in the habit of reheating these same foods regularly. A spouse, a sibling, a close friend, and send them this video. You might genuinely be doing them a favor in a way they'll remember. And if you want to know the 3 specific habits at dinner that I tell almost all of my patients to change first, because they make the biggest difference in long-term digestive and cellular health without requiring any expensive supplements or dramatic dietary overhaul. That's exactly what I'm covering in the next video, so don't miss it.